So, picture this Alexandra, 32, living on her own in a cozy little apartment in the city she's worked hard to build for herself. Life is mostly calm, predictable until one birthday changes everything. I mean, it started like any other day. But by the end of it, nothing felt the same. And before we dive in, I want to know, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The morning of Alexandra's 32nd birthday started like any other in her apartment. Except, for one thing, the silence. It wasn't oppressive at first, just noticeable. Usually, by 7 a.m., her phone would be buzzing off the hook. Mom's voice message, slightly off key but bursting with cheer, would float in with a string of happy birthday wishes. Molly, her younger cousin, would flood her inbox with emojis, memes, little inside jokes that always made her grin. Today, nothing. The screen stayed dark, the sunlight cutting across the blinds, feeling strangely cold. Alexandra made her coffee, the steam curling lazily as she watched the city wake up through her window. It was a familiar ritual, one that usually brought comfort. But this morning, there was a tinge of something else, an unspoken feeling she couldn't quite place. By 9, a single message appeared. It was from her mom. "Happy birthday, sweetie. Sorry things are so hectic here. We'll have to do something low-key tonight. Love you." The words should have been warm, but they weren't. It felt logistical, like she was an item on a checklist rather than the person whose birthday it was. Alexandra stared at the screen, swirling the coffee in her mug, feeling the subtle chill creep into her chest. Hectic was their default state, a constant excuse for postponement, for delegating, for needing something from her. She typed back the only reasonable response she could muster. "No problem, Mom. Looking forward to it." Simple, accommodating. The Alexandra they all knew, reliable and uncomplaining. The phone buzzed again almost immediately. This time, it was Vanessa, her best friend, calling right on schedule at 9:05 am. Her voice was bright, energetic, a burst of warmth that made Alexandra smile in a way she hadn't yet that morning. "Happy birthday. Alex, I swear you don't age. So, what's the plan? Dinner, drinks, is Nancy making her lasagna? Can I sneak the recipe this year?" Alexandra laughed softly, a sound that felt foreign in the quiet apartment. "Hey, V, thanks. No, just a Loki thing tonight. Mom said things are hectic." Vanessa paused, the voice on the other end shifting from celebration to caution. She was good at reading between the lines, better than anyone Alexandra knew. Hectic. What does that mean? Colin's back acting up? Or is Molly starting a new podcast at midnight and dragging everyone along? Alexandra swirled the dregs of her coffee, uncertain. "I don't know, just hectic," she admitted, shrugging at the empty room. Vanessa's tone softened, reassuring yet firm. "Well, my offer still stands. I can ditch my boring Wednesday night and we can hit that Italian place you love. My treat." It was tempting, almost enough to make her break from habit. But family obligation was like a second skin, deeply ingrained, almost reflexive. "Thanks, V, but I should be with them. It's my birthday. I'm sure it'll be fine." Vanessa sighed, a mixture of frustration and worry in her voice. "Call me later, and I mean it. Don't let them walk all over you." "Not today." Alexandra promised she would, ending the call and sitting in her apartment, letting the morning stretch around her. She had taken the day off work, telling herself she needed a mental break, but her thoughts kept circling back to spreadsheets and data models. Numbers were safe, predictable, logic was comforting, and easier than staring at the vague disappointment settling in her chest. By 4 p.m., her mom called, the rush in her voice unmistakable, the television blaring in the background. "Hi, honey, just calling about tonight. Your Uncle Colin and I are just completely wiped out. It's been a day. Would you be terribly upset if we just ordered some takeout and called it an early night? We can celebrate properly on the weekend." Alexandra felt that familiar pang, the old, sharp sting of being deprioritized. She had felt it countless times. But on her birthday, it hurt in a way that was new. Or maybe it was that she could finally recognize it without rationalizing it away. "Oh, sure. Mom, that's fine. Whatever's easiest for you guys." Her mom's relief was palpable, almost audible over the phone. "You're a doll. I'll order pizza to your place. Your favorite, pepperoni and mushroom." Alexandra's voice was small, polite. "Okay, thanks." Her mother added the usual affectionate sign-off. "All right, sweetie. Happy birthday again. We love you. Talk tomorrow." And then the call ended. Just like that, the day of celebration had been reduced to a logistical problem solved with a pizza delivery. She looked around her silent apartment, the space echoing the emptiness she felt inside. The hectic day they'd had somehow drained them of any energy to celebrate her birthday, and she understood. She always had. So, she accepted it. The pizza arrived at 6:30 p.m. The delivery guy cheerfully wishing her a happy birthday because of the note her mom had left. It was a gesture, but it was worse than forgetfulness. It was performative. Alexandra tipped generously, set the box down, and let the quiet weigh on her. 2 slices later, standing in the kitchen, she scrolled through her phone. A few messages trickled in from friends and former colleagues. Each was met with a cheerful thank you, an emoji that masked the reality of her solitary day. She tucked the rest of the pizza away, her stomach uneasy at the thought of more. By 8 p.m., she gave up on forcing normalcy. Pajamas on, face washed, she climbed into bed, laptop on her comforter, mind numbed by the canned laughter of a mindless show. She whispered to herself, rationalized, convinced herself it was just a day, that they were tired, stressed, and loved her, and that they'd make it up on the weekend. But as the blue light of the screen bathed her face, loneliness settled in fully. Not just missing a dinner or a cake, but the quiet realization that the people who were meant to put her first had, once again, overlooked her existence. She closed her eyes before 9, the emptiness of her apartment echoing the beginning of what would be a pivotal night. Alexandra's family dynamic wasn't something that had come together overnight. It had been years in the making, built slowly and quietly, almost imperceptibly. Her father had passed away when she was in college, leaving behind a modest life insurance policy that should have been a cushion, a safety net for the family. But within 5 years, that cushion had been completely gone, managed, spent, and often mismanaged by her mother, Nancy. There wasn't malice in it, at least not intentional, but there was a fundamental inability to live within means, a lack of financial foresight that seemed to be a trait shared by her Uncle Colin. Both were kind people, well-meaning in their own ways, but it always seemed that when life got hard, Alexandra was expected to fill the gaps. From a young age, she had fallen into this rhythm without questioning it. She was the pragmatic one, the stable one, the adult in a room of dreamers and risk-takers. Her cousin Molly was the star of the family in a very particular way. Beautiful, charming, and always pursuing the next creative venture. One month, she'd be an event planner. The next, a jewelry maker. And then a lifestyle blogger with a small but growing audience. Every new passion required investment. And because Molly was seen as the star, the family swooped in, or rather, Alexandra swooped in, often quietly and without complaint. She bought the laptops, funded the photography classes, even contributed to the travel expenses for one of Molly's fledgling influencer gigs. Each transaction felt like a small emergency at the time, a temporary fix for something that seemed urgent. But in reality, it was a pattern that never broke. Her mother, Nancy, was not malicious but distracted and financially disorganized, and she leaned on Alexandra almost instinctively. A phone bill here, a utility payment there, a chunk of mortgage money when Colin was behind on hours. Alexandra's contributions were constant, almost invisible. Colin was a hard worker, but life always seemed to throw him curveballs, his truck breaking down. Hours cut unexpectedly, bills piling up. And Alexandra, with a stable job as a senior data analyst, a meticulous sense of organization, and a bank account she had built carefully over the years, was a solution. She helped because she could, because she was the one who was expected to, and because, honestly, she wanted to. That sense of responsibility had become part of her identity. She was the reliable Alexandra, the one who made sure the family's infrastructure stayed intact while everyone else pursued dreams or dealt with setbacks. Her best friend, Vanessa, however, saw it differently. She called it the reliability tax. Over coffee one afternoon, months before the birthday that would later become pivotal, Vanessa had leaned in, voice low, serious. "Alex, you're so dependable that they've forgotten you're a person with your own needs. You're basically a line item in their budget car payment, groceries, your contribution. It's not healthy." Alexandra had laughed it off at the time. "It's not like that," she said. "They do the same for me." And in some ways, she wanted to believe it. She wanted to see the balance, to feel that reciprocity existed. But deep down, a part of her knew that wasn't true. The reality was much more one-sided, and she had structured her life entirely around never needing help herself, so she could be the helper for everyone else. The early years of her career had only cemented this pattern. Alexandra remembered the first time she started contributing financially a small bill, maybe a phone payment, which slowly escalated. One month, it was groceries, the next utilities, then a part of her mother's mortgage. When Colin needed new tires for his truck, she was the one who paid. Molly's photography phase demanded a new laptop, and Alexandra bought it, thinking it was a short-term thing. These transactions were framed as emergencies, as temporary measures. "Just until this next big job comes through," Nancy would say. "Just until I get my hours back," Colin promised. But the big job never seemed to arrive. The pattern persisted. Each act of support, and while motivated by care, came with an emotional toll Alexandra rarely acknowledged at the time. There were weekends spent at Colin's cramped house, listening to him talk about lumber prices or the rising costs of supplies while Molly and her friends flitted around taking photos for Instagram. The wine and cheese platter Alexandra brought was photographed, posted, celebrated by everyone else. But her role was invisible. Her contributions were expected, taken for granted, folded seamlessly into the family's operations. And over time, she stopped counting the cost, not because she didn't notice, but because keeping track would have meant admitting what the arrangement really was. It wasn't help anymore, it was enabling. And the line had long blurred between duty and exploitation. Alexandra's life outside of family obligations was a careful balance. She thrived in her work, creating order out of chaos, patterns out of scattered data points. But at home, the chaos never ended. Financial requests, emotional labor, small favors piled on top of each other. Every time she said yes, it reinforced the expectation that she would always say yes, that she was inexhaustible. Each birthday, holiday, or minor family event became a test of endurance, a reminder of her role as the unshakable support system. She gave without question, hoping love and acknowledgement would naturally follow. Though, in reality, acknowledgement was rare, and love was measured by how much she could do for them. Even as she gave, she understood the imbalance intellectually. Vanessa's warnings echoed in her mind. She began to notice the patterns requests timed around Molly's birthdays, sudden financial shortfalls coinciding with a new creative endeavor. The subtle way obligations were framed to appear urgent, unavoidable. Each time, Alexandra stepped up, adhering to the invisible contracts she had internalized, while the emotional reciprocity she longed for remained largely absent. Her feelings were quietly sidelined, her achievements met with polite acknowledgement at best. She saw it all, but she kept her mouth shut, kept her contributions flowing, because conflict was messy, and she was conditioned to maintain harmony. Alexandra's reflection wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. She knew she was skilled at seeing patterns, connecting dots, and analyzing systems. And she could see her family's system clearly now. She was the dependable one, the constant, the foundation everyone leaned on. Molly was the star, the focus of attention, the one whose needs and milestones were celebrated extravagantly. Colin and her mother were caught in cycles of mismanagement and distraction, often charming, sometimes exasperating, but ultimately relying on Alexandra to hold it all together. Each financial transaction, each overlooked favor, each expected yes, was a data point in the larger pattern of dependency. And yet, she had long filtered these patterns through the lens of love and duty. She accepted her role, embraced it in ways, and prided herself on her reliability. The sacrifices felt like proof of her devotion, a way to measure her commitment to her family. But the warning from Vanessa lingered because it was true she was paying a price. A reliability tax that wasn't acknowledged, that wasn't shared. Her own needs, her own moments of joy and recognition were consistently deprioritized. The subtle manipulation, the way obligations were framed, the way gratitude was performative, the way crises conveniently coincided with her resources was never overt. But it was there. She had seen the pattern for years, but had rationalized it, softened it, overlaid it with her affection and loyalty. This backdropped the years of financial support, the habitual self-sacrifice, The careful maintenance of family infrastructure was the foundation on which everything else in her life rested. It explained why she accepted logistical birthday updates over calls, why she quietly tolerated being sidelined in her own family milestones, and why she felt a mix of love, frustration, and resignation that was hard to untangle. Each example, from covering a phone bill to funding a camera for Molly, from standing by while her family celebrated small wins at her expense, was a brick in the wall of obligation she had built around herself. As her 32nd birthday approached, these patterns weren't just background noise anymore, they were signals. The small, seemingly innocuous routines and gestures had a cumulative weight. They hinted at a system in which her contributions were essential, yet invisible, valued only for the utility they provided. And Alexandra, the thoughtful, analytical observer she had always been, began to recognize that these patterns weren't accidental. They were recurring, predictable, and reflective of a deeper dynamic. She was the support, the backbone, the quiet provider, and she had been conditioned to accept it as normal. The time for questioning, she would realize, was coming, and it would change everything. The evening started quietly, almost too quietly, with a call from her mom around 4 o'clock. Alexandra answered, coffee in hand, a twinge of anticipation in her chest. Her mom's voice was tired, rushed, a low hum of background noise, probably the television. "Hi, honey, just calling about tonight," she said. "Your Uncle Colin and I are completely wiped out. It's been a day. Would you be terribly upset if we just ordered some takeout and called it an early night? We can celebrate properly on the weekend." Alexandra froze for a moment, the words settling in her chest. This was familiar territory, a subtle reshuffling of priorities that always seemed to put her on the back burner. She could almost feel the invisible weight of obligation pressing down, the lifelong habit of accommodating without complaint. "Oh, sure. Mom, that's fine. Whatever's easiest for you guys," she replied softly, trying to steady her voice. It was polite, measured, the kind of response that had become second nature over the years. Her mom exhaled audibly, relief washing over her voice. "You're a doll. I'll order a pizza to your place, your favorite. Pepperoni and mushroom." Alexandra's voice was small, almost lost in the hum of the city outside her window. "Okay, thanks," she said, the words tasting hollow. The conversation ended with a standard, loving sign-off. "All right, sweetie. Happy birthday again. We love you. Talk tomorrow." And just like that, what should have been a night of celebration had been reduced to a logistical task solved with a delivery. Alone in her apartment, Alexandra felt the weight of the absence around her. Usually, her birthday evenings were punctuated with laughter, warmth, and the chatter of family gathered around a table she'd helped set. Tonight, there was none of that. The pizza, when it arrived promptly at 6:30, smelled as comforting as it was ordinary. The delivery guy, cheerful and oblivious to the underlying tension, wished her a happy birthday, carrying a note from her mom. It should have been a small, kind gesture, but it felt performative. A reminder that the effort her family had put into celebrating her day was minimal at best. Alexandra set the box down, tipped generously, and leaned against the counter, feeling the absurdity of the evening. 2 slices later, she was scrolling through her phone, seeking distraction. Messages from friends and former colleagues trickled in. polite and kind. She responded with cheerful emojis, masking the hollow ache settling into her chest. Each message was a lifeline, a reminder that someone outside her immediate family cared. Yet the contrast between the warmth from afar and the emptiness within her apartment felt sharper than ever. And then the Instagram notifications began. Molly's stories appeared, bright and vibrant. Alexandra's chest tightened as the first post filled her screen, a group photo of Molly in the center, glowing, arms clasped under her chin, surrounded by their mother, her uncle, and a dozen friends, all crammed into a restaurant booth decorated with balloons and sparkling lights. In the middle of it all sat a chocolate lava cake, a single sparkler shooting golden sparks into the air. The excitement, the celebration, the smiles, it was everything Alexandra's birthday should have been. But she wasn't there. She'd been deliberately excluded. Her fingers trembled slightly as she continued scrolling through the clips, a toast from Colin, his voice booming with enthusiasm. Nancy leaning in, kissing Molly's cheek, eyes shining with pride. Molly basking in attention, glowing as if the night were entirely hers. The images were a wave of joy, and with each clip, Alexandra's heart sank further. She felt shock, disbelief, and then a growing clarity. This wasn't a mistake, a misunderstanding, or poor planning. This was a calculated exclusion. Her family had chosen to orchestrate a celebration that deliberately left her out. Memories of previous birthdays, past slighted moments, and small disappointments flooded her mind. There were weekends when she had gone to Colin's cramped house, listening to discussions about lumber prices and mortgage issues, while Molly and her friends took pictures for Instagram. There were bottles of wine and cheese platters she had brought, carefully curated, photographed, and celebrated as part of Molly's milestones, while her own contributions remained unseen. The pattern emerged, painfully clear. Now Alexandra had been the invisible foundation, supporting the family silently, while her own joys were sidelined or ignored. The pizza sat on the counter like a monument to the day's absurdity, a comfort that couldn't touch the hollow ache inside her. She sank onto her bed, the phone in her hand trembling. Molly's stories continued, a parade of fawning comments, cheers, and social media praise. Each post was another sharp reminder that her family had deliberately prioritized someone else's happiness over hers. The realization was crushing. This wasn't casual neglect. It was choice, deliberate, conscious, and hurtful. Alexandra's mind raced, layering this evening over years of habitual accommodation. Every favor she had given, every emergency she had responded to, every financial contribution made with quiet acceptance, all pointed to a truth she had been avoiding. She had been the utility, the infrastructure. Molly was the ornament. Each birthday, each family milestone, each small moment of joy her family celebrated had been calibrated to exclude her, even subtly. Even when it was just a phone call, an Instagram story, a gathering she wasn't invited to. She felt the betrayal in layers, the shock of the immediate exclusion, the stark contrast between her solitary evening and Molly's celebration, and the long-standing pattern of her family's behavior now made undeniably clear. The emotional labor she had carried for years, the financial support she had provided silently, all of it had not only gone unacknowledged, but had become a baseline expectation. Her presence was not desired, her celebration not important. The night illuminated this truth with brutal clarity. Alexandra put her phone down, the glow from the screen fading, leaving only the dim lights of her apartment and the hum of the refrigerator. The rationalizations she had repeated to herself over the years. They're tired. They love me. They'll make it up on the weekend, no longer held weight. This wasn't oversight. It wasn't poor planning. It was choice. And with that recognition came the first twinge of clarity amid the heartbreak. The calculated nature of the betrayal was a fact, a datum in the ledger of her family's treatment of her. It was deliberate, and it demanded acknowledgement. She traced the ceiling with her eyes, thinking of all the birthdays she had spent accommodating everyone else, all the milestones she had quietly funded or supported. The stark contrast of this night was a wake-up call, a clear signal that her role in this family was as a resource, not as a cherished member. The realization, while painful, brought an unexpected form of understanding. The betrayal wasn't chaotic or accidental. It was structured, intentional, and revealing. The invisible threads of expectation, obligation, and unspoken hierarchy that had shaped her life were now visible, illuminated by Molly's celebration and the absence of her own family. Alexandra felt a mixture of emotions: hurt, disbelief, and a creeping, cold clarity. This wasn't just a bad birthday. It was a message encoded in years of patterns, delivered with surgical precision on what was supposed to be her day. The stark, intentional contrast between the celebration she had been promised and the one her family enacted for someone else was undeniable. And in that moment, as she lay on her bed, the evening fading around her, she understood something crucial. This was more than exclusion. It was a revelation. Her family had acted with intent, and the years of subtle manipulations, omissions, and expectations were now fully visible. The night ended with Alexandra in bed, the remnants of the pizza uneaten, her mind a swirl of emotions and thoughts. The Instagram stories had ceased, leaving only the echo of joy she wasn't part of. The silence of her apartment was complete, heavy with understanding and grief. She whispered the rationalizations she had rehearsed over the years, but they felt empty now. This night was a turning point, a fracture in the patterns she had long accepted. It was the evening that laid bare the calculated nature of her family's disregard, a moment of revelation that would become the foundation for the decisions she would soon make alone in her apartment. Alexandra faced the uncomfortable truth she had been deliberately excluded, and the pattern of her family's behavior had been intentional all along. It was a bitter, piercing clarity, intimate and inescapable, and it marked the beginning of a reckoning she could no longer avoid. The next morning, Alexandra woke up with a strange mix of lingering hurt and a creeping sense of resolve. The previous night's revelations, Molly's Instagram celebration, the calculated exclusion, the performative pizza delivery had left a bitter taste in her mouth, one that demanded clarity. She needed to see the full picture, not just the isolated moments that had been swirling in her mind. So she did what came naturally. She turned to data. She opened her laptop and created a simple spreadsheet, the kind she was used to at work. Rows and columns ready to hold the cold. Hard facts of her family's financial needs and her compliance. Column A, date. Column B, amount. She began scrolling back through her online banking portal, month by month, year by year, digging through old transactions, each one a small excavation into her own generosity. The early entries were almost laughably small: $50 for groceries here, $100 for a utility bill there, but the frequency increased quickly. Each number told a story: the $800 she sent her mom for a dental emergency, which coincidentally coincided with a weekend Molly was away at a music festival. The $1,500 she transferred to Colin for truck repairs. Just days before, he posted pictures of a brand new big screen TV in his living room. Her chest tightened as she scrolled further, the pattern beginning to emerge. By the end of the first hour, Alexandra had a clearer picture. Small, frequent transactions formed the foundation. But then there were the big ones, the loans and contributions that had been repaid only in gratitude, never in cash. $5,000 sent to her mother to consolidate credit card debt, a loan that never saw a single repayment. $2,000 for Molly's professional camera during her photography phase. Each line, each figure, was a piece of evidence of her role as the family's emergency fund, their unacknowledged line of credit. As she entered each number, Alexandra felt a mix of emotions: irritation, disbelief, and finally, a cold clarity. She could see, in the stark, linear format of her spreadsheet, the exploitative rhythm of her family's requests. Cross-referencing dates with social media history in her own calendar, she realized that many of these financial requests weren't coincidental. They clustered around Molly's birthdays, new business ventures, and vacations. Timing, she realized, was never random. It was carefully orchestrated, a pattern that, when viewed through the lens of objective analysis, became impossible to ignore. Her heart pounded as she recorded yet another entry: $2,500 for a last-minute trip Molly had insisted was essential for her blog content. Alexandra remembered the argument she had had with herself before agreeing, rationalizing it as a necessary temporary fix, an investment in family happiness. But in the spreadsheet, these rationalizations fell away. Each dollar became a stark, factual representation of her generosity being taken for granted. She was no longer filtering these numbers through a lens of love or duty. She was seeing them as they truly were: evidence of ongoing exploitation. The spreadsheet began to feel like a revelation in itself, a turning point. Years of rationalization, the mental gymnastics she had performed to justify loans, gifts, and favors were stripped away by the simple, undeniable facts. The totals began to accumulate, the sum growing steadily as she dug deeper. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. She added in utilities, groceries, emergency funds, and larger, one-time contributions that had been treated as normal obligations. The final tally was staggering. Over the past 5 years alone, she had given her family just over $47,000. $47,000. The numbers stared back at her from the screen, cold, precise, unarguable. It was more than a down payment on a house, more than the cost of a master's degree, more than a decade of careful budgeting. And what had she received in return? Polite thank yous, acknowledgement only in passing, and, most painfully, exclusion from her own birthday. Alexandra sat back, staring at the spreadsheet. She could trace each dollar to a story, a moment, a subtle manipulation she had ignored or rationalized. There was the $50 she paid to cover a late utility bill, The one Nancy had framed as just until payday, while Molly was out taking pictures for a blog post she didn't need funding for. There was the $1,500 she sent Colin for truck repairs that, in hindsight, coincided with a weekend when he splurged on new furniture. And the big ones, the $5,000 loan to consolidate her mother's credit card. The $2,000 camera purchase for Molly, these were no longer faceless numbers. Each one was a reflection of a family that relied on her, not out of necessity alone, but out of expectation and entitlement. She thought about the pattern, how predictable it all had been. Every request, every emergency, every plea for help clustered around moments that were convenient for her family, often coinciding with events where she would be distracted or unavailable. The timing wasn't accidental, it was methodical. And seeing it laid out in front of her, in neat columns and totals, the emotional clarity hit with the force of a revelation. Alexandra realized that she had been enabling a system, one that was dependent on her consistency and her willingness to prioritize others' needs above her own. The spreadsheet wasn't just numbers, it was proof. Proof that her years of accommodating, of stretching herself thin, of being the reliable one had been taken advantage of systematically. Her eyes traced the entries once more, the $800 for her mom's dental emergency, the $1,500 for Colin's truck, the $2,000 for Molly's camera, and the $5,000 loan for credit card consolidation. All of them now painted a story she could no longer ignore. She could see how much of her life had been dedicated to funding not just their immediate needs, but a lifestyle that consistently excluded her. The pattern was undeniable. The evidence was clear. And for the first time, she stopped rationalizing. She stopped telling herself, "They're stressed, they're tired, they're family." She didn't dismiss her own pain, didn't soften the edges with excuses. The spreadsheet gave her clarity, and clarity was power. Her mind went through each interaction, each birthday, each subtle slight, now seen through the lens of this concrete evidence. The casual exclusion on her 32nd birthday was not an isolated event. It was the latest data point in a series spanning years. Each dollar given, each favor done, each time she bent to accommodate them, had reinforced a system where she was indispensable yet invisible. The cold arithmetic of the spreadsheet left no room for emotional distortion, no room for the mental gymnastics she had perfected over a lifetime. Here were the facts. $47,000 over 5 years. Gifts and loans ignored or taken as entitlements. Her presence on her own birthday actively minimized. It was undeniable. It was complete. It was proof. Alexandra felt a strange sense of empowerment rising through the shock. The spreadsheet had crystallized what she had long sensed, but had been unable to articulate. She didn't have to argue, plead, or justify herself anymore. The numbers spoke for her. The ledger of generosity and exploitation was clear and irrefutable. She was done rationalizing, done excusing, done minimizing the cumulative weight of her own sacrifices. The spreadsheet was no longer just a document. It was a mirror reflecting the truth of her family's dependence and disregard. Sitting in her apartment, Alexandra felt a new clarity in her chest. She could see exactly how her own life had been structured around serving others at the expense of recognition, acknowledgement, and even simple joy. Each entry in the spreadsheet was a testament to her diligence, her patience, and her unrecognized labor. Each dollar was a silent witness to the expectations placed upon her. And now, seeing it all, she began to recognize that this was more than financial support. It was a system of emotional and practical exploitation she had allowed to persist. Out of habit, out of love, and out of the fear of being selfish. She leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of the realization settle. The evidence was undeniable, the pattern unmistakable, the betrayal stark. The spreadsheet had transformed years of vague, gnawing unease into concrete clarity. She could see the rhythm, the consistency, the deliberate timing, and the sheer magnitude of her contributions. It was no longer a matter of perception, it was a matter of data. And in that data, Alexandra found something she hadn't expected. Not just anger or hurt, but clarity. And with clarity, a sense of control. The ledger had become her proof, her turning point. For the first time, she could stop excusing the behavior of others and begin asserting her own boundaries. The spreadsheet was a moment she stopped rationalizing and started claiming her own life. After staring at the spreadsheet for hours, Alexandra felt a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity. The numbers were undeniable, the pattern painfully obvious. She had spent years funding her mother, her uncle, and Molly, always accommodating, always excusing, always rationalizing. But now, staring at the totals and dates, she realized she didn't have to keep doing this. The revelation wasn't just intellectual, it was visceral. Every nerve in her body seemed to hum with the possibilities of reclaiming her own life. She leaned back in her chair, feeling a cold, steady resolve settle over her. This wasn't about anger, it was about survival, about self-preservation, about finally setting boundaries that had never existed. Anxiety flickered in her stomach. What if they called? What if they begged? What if they tried to manipulate her into compliance? But with that anxiety came a surprising sense of empowerment, a quiet thrill that, for the first time in years, she would be in control. Alexandra started to plan carefully. She knew her family too well. Any sudden withdrawal would trigger panic, anger, and manipulative texts or calls. She pictured the likely scenarios: her mom feigning exhaustion, Colin offering excuses, Molly pouting or complaining. She rehearsed her responses over and over. No yelling, no pleading, no justifying. She didn't need to argue or defend herself. Her silence and the spreadsheet of facts would speak for her. Her first act was digital blocking phone numbers, social media accounts, and email addresses, one by one. Each tap was oddly ritualistic, a small, tangible assertion of her autonomy. Anxiety bubbled beneath the surface, the kind that comes when you defy years of ingrained expectation. But she pushed through. Each block was a statement. This is where my responsibility ends, and my life begins. Almost immediately, the first attempts to reach her began. Missed calls, texts from new numbers, emails that had once been innocuous now felt desperate. She could see the strategy forming friends' phones, alternate addresses, attempts to bypass the barriers she'd built. Alexandra's heart raced with the tension of resisting the urge to respond, but she held firm. Each ignored call and unanswered text reinforced the boundaries she was setting. She reminded herself they were not reaching out because they cared. They were reaching out to extract, and she refused. Days passed, and the pattern continued, frantic and predictable. Each message carried the same undertone: subtle guilt, feigned concern, veiled urgency. Each new number or account was another test, Alexandra observed, noting the effort, the strategy, and the emotion behind each attempt. She refused to engage, to validate the expectation that she remained endlessly available. The spreadsheet had already confirmed the pattern. Now her actions aligned with that knowledge. Her silence was intentional, a consequence, not cruelty. During this period, Alexandra maintained her daily routines. She went to work, exercised, cooked for herself, cleaned her apartment, and took time for projects she had long neglected. Each act of care for herself felt revolutionary. Cooking her own meal, washing the dishes, folding laundry, mundane tasks became exercises in reclaiming space and autonomy. She noticed the subtle relief in her chest with every choice made for herself, every moment that didn't involve appeasing others. It was a quiet, almost meditative discipline, and it reinforced the growing sense of empowerment. There were moments of temptation, brief flashes when she imagined texting back, explaining, softening the blow, smoothing over hurt feelings. Her inner dialogue tugged at her, maybe just a quick message, maybe just a simple check-in. But she countered immediately with reasoned reflection. She remembered the spreadsheet, the clear, cold numbers, the evidence of years of taking on their burdens. She whispered to herself, "I am not cruel. I am not selfish. I am establishing a boundary." Each repetition reinforced her resolve and calmed the gnawing doubt. Vanessa became her anchor. They spoke nightly, Alexandra recounting the ongoing attempts to reach her. Vanessa reminded her of the rationality of her actions, grounding her when doubt crept in. "They're trying to pull you back in," Vanessa said on the fourth night. "The silence is making them anxious, not because they miss you, but because they expect money. They're not worried about you, they're worried about their access." Alexandra admitted to a flicker of guilt. Pacing the living room, Vanessa was firm. "You're not being mean. You're applying a consequence to a system they've depended on for too long. Your silence is proportional, logical. It's not cruel. It's overdue." The more Alexandra resisted, the more she noticed a shift in herself. The constant tension that had defined her life, the low-grade stress of being perpetually on call for family needs, was lifting. Each day she ignored a message. Each time she did not respond. She felt the weight of obligation dissolve. She could feel the energy and attention she had once spent on managing their crises returning to her. The anxiety remained, but it was balanced with a growing, deliberate sense of control. She was reclaiming what had been eroded over years of accommodation. By the end of the week, the family's panic was evident. Calls, texts, and emails multiplied, but Alexandra's discipline remained unbroken. She noticed their desperation, the veiled pleas, the thinly disguised guilt, and each attempt only confirmed the necessity of her withdrawal. Her role as the family's resource was no longer being taken for granted. It was being tested, and she met that test with patience, clarity, and resolve. Sitting on the couch one evening, the apartment quiet around her, Alexandra reflected on what she had accomplished. The spreadsheet had revealed the truth, the withdrawal, the blocking, the disciplined silence enacted the consequence. She was no longer at the mercy of their expectations. The control, the power, The peace of acting entirely for herself was intoxicating. She could breathe, plan, and live without anticipating the next urgent request, the next subtle manipulation. She was no longer reactive. She was proactive. Alexandra felt a natural, human mix of emotions, residual anxiety at breaking ingrained patterns, satisfaction in her discipline, and a quiet exhilaration in reclaiming autonomy. The tension between old habits and new boundaries created a rhythm, a pulse, that was both uncomfortable and liberating. Each ignored notification, each unanswered call, became a marker of regained power. She was finally prioritizing herself without apology, without guilt, without fear. The apartment, once a space of ongoing emotional labor, now felt expansive, safe, and entirely her own. The ringing of phones, the flashes of new numbers, the persistent attempts to pierce her digital barrier all met with calm and unwavering resolve. She had drawn a line, not in the sand, but in concrete. She was the architect of her own life. The mix of anxiety, tension, and empowerment she felt was profound, visceral, and completely human. She had finally claimed her autonomy, asserting boundaries that had long been absent, and in doing so, had discovered a quiet, lasting power that had been hers all along. A few days after Alexandra had enacted her digital withdrawal, the confrontation she had been preparing for arrived, inevitable and intense. She was working from home, the apartment quiet, productivity humming around her, when the intercom buzzed. A shrill, unfamiliar sound that made her heart spike. She checked the grainy camera on the peephole. Her mother, Nancy, and Uncle Colin were standing on the steps, faces tense, expressions unreadable but heavy with expectation and frustration. Her chest tightened, a knot forming as adrenaline surged. She knew this moment would come. She had rehearsed it, visualized it, anticipated every word and gesture, but anticipation did not dull the nerves. The intercom buzzed again, longer and more insistent this time. Alexandra remained calm, breathing slowly, refusing to be drawn into the emotional undercurrent that she had learned to navigate her entire life. She recognized the stakes. Any reaction, any crack in her composure could be used against her. The shouting from outside began, muffled but sharp. "Alexandra, I know you're in there. Open this door right now." Her mother's voice was high, tense, demanding. Alexandra's fingers hovered over the deadbolt. She reminded herself, calm, factual, controlled. Her heart pounded, the familiar mixture of anxiety and resolve coursing through her. She could hear Colin mumbling behind her mother, an uncomfortable, defeated presence. "Let's just go," he said softly, but Nancy's voice was relentless. "She's going to open this door and listen to me." Alexandra's mind raced, cataloging her options. She would confront them, yes, but on her terms. No yelling, no justification, no apology, just facts and boundaries. Taking a deep breath, Alexandra unlocked the deadbolt, opening the door just enough to see them. Leaving the security chain in place, the expressions she encountered were a mix of surprise and fury. Her mother's face hardened instantly, eyes narrowing. Alexandra met her gaze calmly. "Finally, what is wrong with you? We've been calling and calling. Are you trying to punish us?" Nancy demanded. Alexandra's voice was steady, factual, measured, the way she might present findings in a boardroom. "There's nothing wrong with me," she said, "and I'm not punishing you. I've simply decided to stop funding a family that lies to me and excludes me. You made it very clear on my birthday where I stand. I've accepted that." Her mother scoffed, an immediate counterattack, dismissing her concerns. "Oh, for heaven's sake, you're still on about that. It was a last-minute thing for Molly. We were going to celebrate with you on the weekend. You're blowing this all out of proportion over a silly dinner." Alexandra's tone did not waver. Calm, clear, deliberate. "It wasn't a silly dinner. It was a lie. You said you were tired, that you were staying in. And yet you celebrated Molly with a dinner and a cake 5 hours after telling me it wouldn't happen. The pizza was sent to keep me out of the way while you orchestrated it." Colin shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. "Now, Alex, your mom didn't mean any harm, did she?" he said, voice uncertain, almost pleading. Alexandra's eyes locked onto his. "Was it you, Uncle Colin, who was too wiped out to see me because you looked perfectly energetic in those pictures, toasting Molly's success?" The shame in his expression was immediate. He couldn't deny the evidence. Nancy doubled down, voice rising again, an attempt to reclaim control. "You are being unbelievably selfish after everything we've done for you." Alexandra's gaze never faltered, her voice cold but steady. "Everything I've done for you, I've logged, I have a spreadsheet. I know exactly how much money I've given you, Colin and Molly, over the last 5 years. Over $47,000. What have you done for me, aside from expecting me to be your personal bank?" The mention of a specific number, the tangible evidence of her years of contributions, pierced her mother's denial. Color drained from her face. "So that's what this is about. Money," she sneered, trying to reclaim the narrative. Alexandra's voice was firm, unwavering, logical. "No, this isn't about money. It's about the pattern, the behavior, the exclusion. The spreadsheet is just the proof. The birthday was the final evidence. I'm done. The financial support ends now, and so does this conversation." She began to close the door. Her mother's hand shot out, slapping against it, a last attempt at physical control. "You can't do this." "The mortgage," Nancy shouted. Alexandra's voice cut through, calm and icy. "That is not my problem anymore. You have a new influencer in the family. I suggest you ask her for help." She slid the deadbolt back into place, leaning against the door, body trembling slightly from adrenaline but resolute. Behind the door, her mother's screams continued, a litany of insults and accusations. Alexandra closed her eyes and waited, letting the noise wash over her without breaking her composure. Gradually, the shouting subsided, replaced by the sound of retreating footsteps. For the first time in years, there was only silence. It was not sudden or explosive, but slow, creeping, profound. Alexandra exhaled, the tension draining from her shoulders. She felt the weight of expectation, obligation, and emotional manipulation lift. Her apartment, once a site of anxiety and duty, was hers again. The aftermath was a period of quiet adjustment. Alexandra monitored her phone. No calls, no texts, no further attempts to breach the boundaries she had set. The silence was telling. Her family wasn't concerned about her well-being. They were frustrated by the loss of control, the withdrawal of her resources. Each day of silence reinforced her decision. She continued her routine's work, exercise, cooking, cleaning, each small act an affirmation of autonomy. Vanessa checked in daily, providing a sounding board and reassurance. "How are you holding up?" she would ask. Alexandra's replies were measured, calm. "I think I'm okay," she would say. And it was true. She wasn't celebrating or gloating. She was experiencing the profound relief of finally having agency, of no longer being at the mercy of manipulation and expectation. The silence itself became a symbol of her assertion, a quiet, undeniable demonstration that boundaries were real and enforceable. Financially, the impact was immediate. The portion of her paycheck that had been earmarked for family support remained in her accounts, now redirected toward her own savings and investments. The liberation was tangible. The first significant indulgence, a solo trip to a coastal town she'd long wanted to visit, was booked on a whim, a radical act of selfishness that felt wholly deserved. With each passing day, the combination of emotional clarity and practical freedom reinforced her sense of empowerment. Alexandra's life, once consumed by the quiet labor of supporting a family that had taken her for granted, shifted. The tension, the anxiety, the habitual self-sacrifice all gave way to clarity and control. Her apartment, her time, her energy, her life was once again hers. The confrontation at the door, with its verbal sparring, the presentation of evidence, and the final symbolic gestures of closing the door and sliding the deadbolt, marked the culmination of years of unseen labor and emotional navigation. For the first time, she acted entirely for herself, with intention, discipline, and resolve. The experience was a mixture of relief, tension, and profound satisfaction. Alexandra had faced the confrontation she had anticipated, employed her evidence to assert boundaries, and survived the emotional turbulence. She had resisted the ingrained urge to explain, appease, or justify. Her calm, factual responses, backed by concrete proof, had dismantled the manipulative dynamics of her family, at least within her own sphere. The door, closed and locked, was more than a barrier. It was a declaration of autonomy, a protective measure, and a symbolic act of reclaiming her life. As she stood there, leaning against the door, Alexandra reflected on the human complexity of the situation. Anxiety mingled with empowerment, fear intertwined with resolve, emotional tension balanced by intellectual clarity. It was a profoundly human experience, fraught, difficult, and ultimately liberating. She had asserted control over her life in a manner both deliberate and courageous. And in that quiet moment, after the footsteps faded, after the screams ceased, Alexandra felt an unparalleled sense of peace. She had done what was necessary. She had set boundaries that could not be ignored. She had claimed her life back, one calculated, intentional step at a time, in the days and weeks after the confrontation. Alexandra experienced a kind of quiet she hadn't known in years. The barrage of calls, the frantic texts, the constant pleas and manipulations, all of it had stopped for the first time. The silence wasn't heavy with tension or obligation. It was her own, expansive and peaceful. Her family had tried, predictably, to breach the boundaries she had set. But without her response, without her compliance, their frantic attempts dwindled. She watched the silence stretch, realizing that she didn't have to fix, manage, or provide anymore. It was a new rhythm, one dictated solely by her own choices. Financially, the impact was immediate and tangible. The portion of her paycheck that had been automatically earmarked for her mother, her uncle, and Molly remained in her accounts. No more late-night transfers, no more emergency funds, no more covering up for their oversights. She began to see her savings grow in real time, a satisfying visual proof of autonomy. Every increase in her account balance was a small victory, a direct reflection of the choices she had finally made for herself. The freedom that came with financial independence was deeply intoxicating. A stark contrast to the years she had spent funneling resources into obligations that weren't reciprocal. Alexandra started to plan for herself in ways she never had before. For the first time in years, vacations were about her, not about visiting family who would inevitably extract from her resources. She booked a solo trip to a quiet coastal town she had always wanted to visit, a decision that felt almost rebellious, but liberating. She chose the small, cozy inn over a larger resort, the kind of space where she could be alone with her thoughts, reflecting on her life and her choices. Walking along the empty beaches, feeling the salt air against her face, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't in a long time: unfiltered peace. The vacation wasn't just leisure, it was a reclamation, a statement that her life, her joy, her space was hers alone, back home. The changes continued to ripple through her daily life. Alexandra noticed the subtle shift in her apartment, in her routines, in the way she moved through her day. Without the constant interruptions, without the emotional labor of responding to her family's needs, she felt a new sense of spaciousness, cooking meals for herself, investing time in her hobbies, organizing her apartment meticulously. These acts, once mundane, now felt empowering. Each choice was deliberate, each moment a small exercise in autonomy. Even the simple act of choosing when to respond to messages or when to turn off her phone became a form of self-assertion. The control she exerted over these small, practical aspects of life reminded her how much she had given up in the past and how satisfying it was to reclaim them. Emotionally, Alexandra moved through stages that felt almost like a tide. At first, there was a residual sadness, a quiet ache for the family she had imagined, the closeness that had never been fully realized. She allowed herself to sit with that sadness, to acknowledge it rather than suppress it as she often had. But gradually, that grief shifted. The sadness became tempered with relief, then with empowerment, and finally with a profound sense of clarity. She could see the life she had been living, the compromises she had made, and recognize that her choices now were wholly hers. She wasn't just free from obligation, she was free to grow, to invest in herself, to define her happiness on her own terms. The quiet also allowed Alexandra to reflect on the emotional and financial patterns she had previously normalized. She revisited the spreadsheet, not as a tool for confrontation this time, but as a reminder of the magnitude of her own contributions and the systemic imbalance she had endured. Looking back, she could see the patterns clearly: the timing of requests, the repeated prioritization of Molly's milestones over her own, the way Colin and her mother had relied on her without reciprocal care. It wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about understanding the scope of her experience and using that understanding to protect herself. The reflection brought a mixture of sadness, yes, but also validation and, importantly, empowerment. Her social connections became even more important in this period. Vanessa continued to check in daily, serving as a reminder that Alexandra's choices were not only valid but necessary. Conversations with friends, phone calls with colleagues, even casual text exchanges felt more meaningful now, because they were interactions chosen freely rather than obligations layered with expectation. The contrast between these voluntary, mutual relationships and the one-sided demands of her family reinforced the wisdom of her decisions. She felt the deep satisfaction of finally aligning her actions with her values and needs. Every practical benefit of withdrawing from her family's demands reinforced her sense of empowerment. Bills she had previously paid for others were now hers to manage as she saw fit. The savings that had been slowly building, unnoticed and unremarked, were now tangible. She could make investments, plan for future security, and indulge in personal projects without guilt or justification. Small, seemingly trivial acts, a dinner out for herself, a new book, a spontaneous weekend trip became symbols of the independence she had carved out. Each choice was a subtle assertion her life was hers to shape. Alongside these practical and financial changes came a shift in her internal narrative. Alexandra no longer questioned whether she was being selfish. She recognized that prioritizing herself was not just acceptable but necessary. The feelings of guilt and obligation that had shadowed her for years lost their grip. She could feel her own needs, wants, and joys as legitimate and urgent, not secondary to the expectations of others. This reorientation of perspective was liberating, almost exhilarating. Her autonomy was not just a theoretical concept. It was manifest in every choice, every action, every quiet, deliberate refusal to bend to external demands. In this period, Alexandra also observed the indirect consequences of her absence. The frantic attempts of her family had initially been a source of tension, but over time, the silence settled into a new normal. She noticed, with some detached curiosity, how the system had adapted without her. The space she had once occupied as an unquestioned provider was no longer automatically filled by anyone else. And yet, life continued. There was no catastrophic collapse, no immediate disaster, just the slow recalibration of dynamics, which reinforced the legitimacy and necessity of her withdrawal. One afternoon, Alexandra reflected on the journey she had undertaken. From the shock of her birthday, the sting of exclusion, the revelation of patterns in the spreadsheet, to the disciplined withdrawal and the eventual confrontation. She could see the arc clearly. It was a story of assertion, of finally aligning her life with her own needs and values. The empowerment she felt was deeply satisfying, precisely because it was hard-won, built on careful analysis, courage, and emotional discipline. The narrative she had been a part of for decades had been rewritten on her terms. Her solo vacation remained a highlight of this period. Walking along quiet beaches, watching the sunset, and breathing in the salty air, Alexandra felt a freedom she had not experienced in years. She had deliberately chosen this trip for herself, without consulting or accommodating anyone else. Each decision about the itinerary, each moment of leisure, was a tangible manifestation of her autonomy. The quiet reflection she allowed herself on the trip reinforced the lessons of self-respect, patience, and the importance of setting boundaries. It was both restorative and revelatory. Returning home, Alexandra noticed the smaller, Everyday changes that marked her newfound independence. Grocery shopping no longer carried the implicit responsibility of provisioning for others. Bills and expenses were hers alone, to manage and allocate as she chose. Even routine household tasks were imbued with a sense of autonomy and ownership. Each small act, whether cooking a meal for herself or tidying her apartment, became a symbol of control and self-determination. Emotionally, the landscape of Alexandra's life shifted as well. The sadness and hurt of the past long-standing patterns of neglect, exclusion, and exploitation began to transform. She allowed herself to feel them fully, to acknowledge the grief of what had been lost. But she did not linger there. The reflection led naturally to empowerment, the satisfaction of finally being able to make choices without fear, guilt, or coercion. The peace she felt was not superficial or fleeting. It was hard-won and deeply grounded in her own assertive actions. Financial independence, emotional clarity, and personal freedom intertwined to create a new sense of balance. Alexandra could plan, dream, and act for herself in ways she had previously only imagined. She could pursue interests and opportunities that had long been deferred, invest in her future, and simply enjoy the rhythm of life on her own terms. The liberation was comprehensive, touching every aspect of her life from the practical to the emotional. Even the occasional check-ins with Vanessa served as affirmations of her choices, sharing moments of discovery, subtle triumphs, or reflections on her autonomy reinforced the sense that her path, difficult as it had been to chart, was the right one. Conversations were mutual, supportive, and validating, in stark contrast to the one-sided dynamics of her family. Alexandra's confidence grew, and with it, a genuine joy in her own company and capabilities. Weeks turned into months, and the silence from her family remained. The apartment that had once been heavy with obligation and expectation now felt expansive, welcoming, and fully her own. She watched her financial security grow, her personal time expand, and her mental and emotional energy return. The life she had built for herself, always on the foundation of hard work and careful planning, was now fully accessible to her, free from manipulation and burden. Alexandra reflected on the totality of her experience: the birthday betrayal, the spreadsheet, the digital withdrawal. The confrontation at the door all had been steps on a journey from invisibility and exploitation to recognition and empowerment. The process was human, fraught with anxiety, tension, and emotional complexity, but ultimately affirming. Each decision, each act of discipline reinforced the fundamental truth she had discovered: her life, her energy, her resources belonged to her first, and she had the right, the duty, and the courage to protect them. In the quiet of her apartment, with her finances secure and her boundaries firmly in place, Alexandra finally experienced a sense of freedom that had eluded her for decades. She was not just surviving, she was thriving. She had created a life defined not by the expectations of others, but by her own values, desires, and choices. The satisfaction of reclaiming control, of asserting boundaries, and of living authentically is profound and deeply human. Peace and liberation were no longer abstract concepts, they were tangible, lived, and hers entirely. Stories like Alexandra's remind us how powerful it can be to set boundaries and honor our own needs. Learning to prioritize yourself, even when it's uncomfortable, is a kind of quiet courage. Think about the relationships in your own life. Where might you reclaim your energy or assert your space? If hearing these personal journeys resonates with you, consider giving this video a like and subscribing. It's a gentle way to make sure you don't miss more stories and lessons about self-respect and empowerment.